One of my absolute favorite sounds of this season is that of Canadian geese decisively flocking together and returning to their summer abodes. Warmer weather, warmer climate, open waters. I think I learned that from my dad, an appreciation of that kind of sound and that kind of habit of the birds. I'm known to, if I'm in my office and I hear the birds somewhere off in the distance, to bolt outside and look around. Looking up at the sky, trying to determine where they're coming from. There's something cool about that association with this season. And I love to imagine these geese and the way that the Lord has programmed them to instinctively know it's time to head south, or in the springtime, to head north. And I see that in other animals and other critters, whether it's squirrels putting together a big stash of acorns, or it's bears looking for a place to sleep for the winter. And I love to hear the sound of those geese as they're acknowledging that it's time. It's time to head back. Jesus knew it was time to go. With him, I wouldn't say it was instinct so much as divine wisdom. He knew in his core that it was time to return to the Father. And that's where we pick up with our passage this morning, chapter 13 of John. John writes that it was just before the Passover festival, and Jesus knew that the hour had come. He was absolutely certain this time is now at hand for him to leave this world and go to the Father. John tells it was just before the Passover. The Passover is the big to-do in the Jewish world, where they kind of relive the events of the Exodus, where God delivered his people. And of course, during the Exodus, we're talking about actual physical bondage that God delivered his people from, out of the grips of Pharaoh. The New Testament authors pick up that theme and they parallel it to the spiritual bondage that we're in and how God is delivering us out of that. So it was just before this festival. John tells us the evening meal was in progress. Now, it's very likely that this evening meal that John references here was the actual Last Supper, where we get our communion meal from. John doesn't go in that direction, so we're not certain of it, but in many ways it parallels what we find in the other Gospels leading up to the death of Jesus. But what John is concerned with is the fact that Judas is sitting there, and Satan had resolved to put it in his heart that he would betray Christ. John, giving us a little more commentary about what's going on with Jesus, tells us that Jesus knew not just that it was time for him to return to the Father, but he also knew with absolute certainty that God the Father had put all authority in his hands. All authority to do what? Well, to issue salvation, to execute judgment, to fulfill everything that God the Father had designed for him. Now Jesus could not fail his mission. It was absolutely impossible. He had every bit of authority of God the Father to do this. You think about that for a moment. What did it mean for Jesus to have all of that authority? Authority for salvation, authority for judgment, authority to follow through with the will of the Father. Is this where he slashes Satan with a bolt of lightning? Is this where he thwarts the efforts of Judas? Is this where he casts out Rome, the colonialists? Or as people would say, Lord, is it time to restore the kingdom to Israel? Their mind goes back to the days of Solomon or David, the glory days of the kingdom, where the kingdom was united and it was together. And they're thinking, Jesus, is this what you're about to do? He had all the authority of God. Is this where he flexes his muscles? He demands that they build a statue of him and worship it. Not quite. He takes the posture of a slave and he washes his disciples' feet. Talk about flipping the script. Talk Talk about building up to. He can do anything, all things. He's all powerful, all capable. The authority of God the Father. And what does he do with it? So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin, and he began to wash his disciples' feet. John tells us that Jesus got up, he took off his outer garment, he took a towel, and he wrapped it around his waist. This would have been the imagery of a slave, of a servant. It's easy to understand. Halloween was just yesterday. You could drive around town and see people dressed up, probably more adults this year than actual kids. And you think, oh, well, there's a Teletubby. I can tell by the way they're dressed. That's a cowboy. I can tell by the way they're dressed. My niece, she's a woman ninja, and she's proud of it. I can tell by the way she's dressed. There's Zorro. There's this. There's that. You look, you know. Jesus' disciples would have looked at him and seen that towel wrapped around his waist and the basin of water and said, he's going as a slave this year. Not going, but truly taking the posture. And he washed their feet. What is so unique about washing the feet of the disciples? Well, to wash one's feet would be to wash what would be considered the filthiest part of their body, particularly in a culture where they walked around on foot, in sandals, on dirt paths, also traveled by animals, so there's refuse and filth. So to wash their feet was to really attend to them. He began to wash his disciples' feet and drying them with a towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, you're going to wash my feet? Do you hear the objection in his voice? Wait, you're doing what? Jesus replied, you do not realize now what I am doing. But later you will understand. And here in the NIV, that word later, it actually translates a phrase that says, if you take notes or you write this down, or this is important, he says, literally, after these things. It's not just in a little bit you're going to kind of get it. He says, after these things, what is he talking about, these things? Here we are, leading up to the Passover, probably at the Last Supper. The cross is right there. Not literally in his life, but it's just down the road, if you will. And he's saying, after these things, it'll make more sense. In other words, for Jesus to be washing his feet, or their feet, there's some symbolism going on. There's a spirituality to what's about to happen. And Peter is emphatic. He says, no, you shall never wash my feet. Literally, he says, unto eternity, you will never do such a thing. Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. To say no part is to say participation. Another way of understanding that is you have no belonging with me. You are not one of my own. If you don't let me wash you. Peter, being the pendulum, who goes from absolutely not, even unto eternity, you shall never do that. He says, then, Lord, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. Jesus answered, those who had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean, and you are clean, not every one of you. So what's he do? He gives them a lesson in hygiene, as you would expect. What is he telling Peter here in this moment? He says, if you don't let me wash you, then you have no part with me. And Peter says, okay, well, let's do the whole thing. And Jesus says, it doesn't work that way. Somebody who's had a bath need only wash their feet. This makes sense. This, even in modern day understanding. A typical person wakes up, they might have a cup of coffee or tea, they take a shower, and they go off to the market. They come back and they think, oh, those mums look nice. I'm going to bring some home to the house. They come home, they think, you know what would look even better if I put those mums in a clay pot with some soil. But they've already woken up, had their coffee, had their shower, they're dressed, they come home with their mums. What do? They take the mums out of the plastic pot and they put them in the clay pot with some soil. And their hands are dirty. What do? Go take a whole shower? Or go wash their hands? You go wash your hands. It makes sense. And that's what Jesus is saying. No. If you've taken a bath, you need only wash your feet. Okay, so what does that mean spiritually? Because that's the direction he's going in. And the understanding here of Jesus as he's speaking to Peter is that in our faith in Christ, we are a redeemed people and we're cleansed. Right? We're made whole. Our hearts, there's been a transformation of spirit. But we still walk in sin that needs to be forgiven, sin that needs to be washed and cleansed. So it's not about redeeming the whole person, but Jesus is saying the necessity of the cross that's before him is something that is ongoing. It's not like we're reborn over and over and over again. We're reborn into the Spirit, into Christ. But there's an ongoing need for forgiveness and the cross. We're never without the need of the cross on this side of glory. And Jesus is giving him this theological lesson and saying, what I'm doing is necessary. And that's where he makes that distinction. He says, you are clean, though not all of you. Who else is sitting at the table? Judas. When he'd finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Such a good teacher. He says, do you understand? Do you understand what I've done for you? You call me teacher and Lord. And rightly so. He's affirming that. Those were common titles that they would apply to him. And he says, it's good that you call me teacher. It's good that you call me Lord. You're right to do so. He says, now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. Prescription. And he says, I've set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. That word example, it means pattern. A model to follow. He said, I've done something for you as an example that you should do for one another. And how does Christ motivate them? I mean, who wants to wash somebody else's feet, particularly in that culture? There's ancient literature that supports the idea that it was only the Gentile slaves who even washed the feet. It wasn't the Jewish slaves. You go to the lowest of the low, the slaves, and they said, not even for the Jewish slaves. We'll give that to the Gentiles. That's how low a posture Jesus took in doing this for his disciples. And in their mind, they're thinking, why would I touch Peter's feet? I mean, he stinks. I don't wash that guy's feet. John's feet. He's got gangrene. Not into it. It's not cool. How does Jesus motivate them? He says, very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a master greater than the one who sent him. He says, no servant is greater than the master. What's the idea? Jesus is saying, if the master is willing to do it, then who's the servant to say no? And there's this motivation as the servant or the one who's sent is looking up and saying, well, if they're willing to do it, why wouldn't I? When I was in high school, I worked for my best friend's father, and he owned a trucking company, a local dairy milk distributing company. So he fleet of trucks, and they go around to the local dairy farms and they pick up milk, and then they bring it down to Hood in Boston, Hood in Linfield, Cabot at the Cabot Creamery in Vermont. And that was his gig, and I worked in his garage, and I'd wash the trucks, I'd clean the trucks, I'd scrape the wheels, I'd paint the wheels, I'd broom, I'd sweep out the bays, I'd literally get on my knees and with a putty knife scrape off the grease from when they service the trucks. That was me. I'd come out of there, I'd look like the grapes of wrath. I'd look like I'd just walked across the barren land. And my boss had a twin brother who worked there who was his mechanic. Great relationship to this day. Really cool guys. They love each other. They respect each other. And I remember my boss's brother telling me when I first started there, and knowing the kind of work that I'd be doing, he says, you know what? My brother will never ask you to do something that he hasn't done himself. He will never ask you to do something that he's not involved with himself. And I thought, how cool is that? As he's telling me, okay, well, I need you to do sweep, clean, get greasy, get dirty, whatever. I'm being told by somebody who's in the trenches as well. And it's a motivator. You get that if you've ever worked for somebody or a parent has said, this is how it is, and you think, well, you know, I don't mind because I've seen them do that. I see them in the trenches as well. And in Christ, as he's giving them this model, this pattern to follow, he's saying, no servant is greater than their master. Your master's willing to do this. That motivates. There's blessing in that. Does Jesus want us to wash one another's feet? Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. Does he want us to wash each other's feet? Not necessarily. What's his heart? What's his desire? He says, I've set for you an example. That word example means a pattern. Something to follow. What does Jesus want his disciples, his followers, to do? What is the pattern that he's laid out before us? In this story, but also in his life. I don't think it'd be helpful to try and figure out, well, what's a one-to-one translation into 2020 Seacoast of New Hampshire? All right, we don't really wash each other's feet. It doesn't have the same meaning, doesn't have the same import as it did 2,000 years ago. So what's a modern day translation of that? I don't think it's helpful to go there. We could come up with some ideas, but we'd be missing a point. Why? Because he set before us a pattern. Not a prescription, but a pattern. And what are the nuts and bolts of this pattern? What is this pattern made of? I'm going to give us 3 suggestions that will help us to model Christ in our lives in the way that he desires. Well, what do we see in the foot washing? What's so unique about it? Why does it stand the test of time in terms of being such a moving story? Because it's radical. It's a radical example of love. Love here is agape love, which traditionally we understand as self-giving. Less concerned with emotion, more concerned with the action. Agape love seeks the best interests of the others. Do we see that in what Jesus models? Is that radical to some level? Radical as in, there's a departure from everyday life. We don't always see that in the world around us, a radical kind of love. It's radical in nature in that it stretches. Right? It can be anything from doing something like this where the person receiving is going, whoa, 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 that's a bit much. We have servants, we have people to take care of that. But radical can also be in the pedestrian of everyday life. I see people who make phone calls to the same person every single week with reliability, and I think that's a radical kind of love right there. That's self-giving. I know that they're not always in the mood for that kind of phone call. I know they're not always in the mood for kind of checking in like that, but they're willing to give of themselves for that. It's a radical example of love. I see it from mothers to children, from fathers to children. I see it between spouses, the self-giving. Radical love is the kind of love that stretches us a bit. We're not always comfortable with it. But it's also radical in nature in terms of who's showing the love. Jesus demonstrated this by taking on the posture of a servant, of a slave. Do you see the humility in that? I wouldn't be surprised if some of us in here thought of Philippians chapter 2, the Christ hymn, where Paul is telling the church in Philippi how to model after Jesus. He says, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, right, that's where John starts off. He said, Jesus knew that all authority had been put in his hand. He had all the authority of God. Paul writes, Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. He didn't leverage that for his own sake. He said, rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, could also be translated slave. Being made in human likeness and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedience to death, even death on a cross, the most heinous form of torture and death in the ancient world. So Jesus models radical love, right? As far as how it stretches us, it's outside of the box, but it's also humbling. And that's why Jesus says, the servant is greater than his master. Look, I'm willing to do it. Come follow me. So what does this pattern look like for us? Well, the first thing is that it's radical. It's a radical kind of love. The second is this. It's a love that points to the cross. It's a love that has us laser focused on the cross of Christ. No matter how we're loving one another, we get to keep our hearts moving in that direction. We get to model it and point others in that direction through the way that we love. And look at how Jesus does it here. At first Peter says, you're going to wash my feet? Lord, it doesn't make sense. He resists that. But Jesus says, after these things, what's he pointing towards? The cross. He says, after these things, it'll make sense. We get to love people with the cross in front of us, knowing that Jesus was willing to give of himself on that piece of wood for the sake of us. That's a model of love. We get to have that paradigm in the back of our mind as we love one another in radical ways. Husband to wife, wife to husband, father to son, daughter to mother, brother and sister to Christ, neighbor to neighbor. The paradigm of the cross. We get to point people in that direction. Just as Jesus said, after these things, you will understand. So first is it's radical. Second is this. It's a love that points to the cross, points to the gospel. And the third one is this. This kind of love models faithfulness. Steadfastness. This is where John starts. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Do you hear that? He loved them to the end. This wasn't partial, it wasn't truncated. There's a great word in the Old Testament. It's often related to how God works with his covenant. The Hebrew word is chesed. And it emphasizes faithfulness. God's chesed. In our English word translation, we often say the steadfastness of God, or the long suffering. That means it's durable, it's reliable, it's consistent. It doesn't move. It's faithful. Just as Jesus loved his own until the end. The telos, like where we get our word telescope, as far as you can see. He loved them to the end. Faithfulness is becoming a lost art, particularly in the Western world. Right? Sticking with it. Sticking it out. We see it in the way that people go from job to job, from school to school, from marriage to marriage. It's just a reality. It gets hard. It's like, well, I'm just going to move on. It's uncomfortable, so I'm just going to move on. We see it in so many different ways. We see it in friendships all the time. You know, it gets a little hard. Okay, we're going to deal with something difficult. So people say, you know what's easier than dealing with it? Than having that conversation? Why don't I just go dark on them for a while? And you just say, well, that was a cool time in my life, but it got hard, so I moved on. Faithfulness is becoming a thing of the past, but look at how Christ modeled long-suffering, steadfastness. Aren't you thankful that he did that for us? Right? Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. What does he model? He says, I give you a pattern. I give you an example to follow. What are the nuts and bolts of that pattern? Well, it's radical. It's radical love. Right? It stretches outside of the box, but it's also radical in that he was that humble and willing to do it. Points to the cross. This kind of love points to the gospel. Jesus said, after these things, you'll understand what it means to be cleansed. You'll understand what it means to love somebody sacrificially. We get to model that in our own lives. We get to have it in our hearts as we love each other, as we encourage each other. And then there's the faithfulness. God models faithfulness to us. So what does he desire? That we wash one another's feet? Not necessarily. But he wants us to love one another faithfully with the gospel in mind. I saw this really cool example on Facebook this last week of teaching children how to color and how to draw. And what they did, I don't think I could do it up here, but they took these animal figures. I think it was an elephant and a giraffe. And they had a piece of paper, and it was kind of like this. And you see how my shadow appears on that piece of paper? So they'd have the animal like this and the piece of paper like that with a light coming down. They'd have the children take a pencil and follow the outline of the animal. And it was a way to learn how to, efficiently and cheaply, economically, but also intelligently learn how to draw. What are you doing? You're giving them a pattern to follow. So they do it a couple times, they start to get it. Well, let's put up another pattern. They do it a couple times and they get it. And after a while, they don't need that pattern right there in front of them anymore. They just instinctively and intuitively, kind of like those geese heading south, they know how to do it. It's built in. In Christ, who cares so desperately, he's got the cross in front of him and he's loving his disciples to the end. He's giving them that example and that pattern to follow. Not that we go around washing one another's feet all the time, but that we be radical in the way that we love each other. We love each other with the gospel in mind. And that we love each other faithfully. That's the pattern. That's the beautiful example. That's the blessed pattern of life. John says, now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them.